Yeah, go ahead and hit the live stream. All right, thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the March 23rd, 2021 Finance Committee of the Council on Post-Secondary Education. I want to remind everyone that the meeting is being live streamed to YouTube for the general public, and all audio and video is being captured and recorded. Heather, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Colby Burks.
I'm here.
Chair Ben Brandsetter.
Here.
Mr. Eric Ferris.
Here.
Vice Chair Hellbauer. Mr. Richard Nelson.
Here.
Dr. Robert Statt. And Ms. Carol Wright.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Heather. We have quorum. Looks like we have 2 meeting minutes that need to be approved, October 20th and December 15th of 2020. Are there any additions or corrections to those minutes? Otherwise, they will be approved as presented. All right, seeing none, minutes are approved. Bill, we're going to move on to item 3, the state budget 21 RS and House Bill 192.
Thank you, Chair Brandstetter. And just so everyone on the call knows, that's the pre-conference committee report, a version of the budget, and it is House Bill 192. The last I heard, and President Thompson may have a more recent update, but the last I heard toward the end of last week was that it had passed and gone to the governor for his review and signature. Do you know, President Thompson, the governor hasn't signed that yet, has he?
Yes, he has. He called me 4 days ago, sometimes last week, I'm sorry. And while I was on the phone with him, he signed it into law. So it's done.
Now, I knew he had signed Senate Bill 135, the performance funding, the revisions to the performance funding statute, but he's also signed the budget bill?
No, he
No,
has
not the budget
Aaron's
bill. I'm
talking about
sorry. I thought you were talking. No, I'm sorry. Yes, no, he hasn't signed the budget bill. No.
Okay. And just so the members of the committee know, we don't have any action items for you today. Everything is in the form of updates, and we'll go quickly through a summary of the state budget and then provide a performance funding update. Then we're going to share with you some policy relevant data that we hope will facilitate a tuition and fee discussion toward the end of the meeting. But this first document that I believe Sean is sharing on his screen, you've seen before. This is the list of post-secondary education budget priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. The council approved this this past December, but I thought it would be helpful just to remind members of the Finance Committee what the priorities of the post-secondary institution campuses, council staff, and council members were for this upcoming fiscal year. And we focused on 2 main priorities, as you already know. One was performance funding, and we requested an additional appropriation of $37.5 million, which represented about a little over a 4% increase in the revised net general fund base for the current year. And then the second big priority was funding for asset preservation. And we had requested that the governor and General Assembly consider a $200 million bond fund for asset preservation. And we were not going to require an institutional match for our institutions because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost and foregone revenues that they were experiencing that were related to that. Just quickly, 2 other things I'll point out. We did request about $1.2 million in new appropriations for KSU's land grant program to meet the federal matching requirement on that program. And then we had a statement in there, as you can see, asking the governor and the General Assembly to provide whatever form of pension relief that they chose to do. And we're going to see how this list of post-secondary education budget priorities match up with what actually happened. Sean, if you'll go to the next document. It's a summary of the free conference committee report budget. Yep, that's it, Sean. Thank you. And just quickly, I'll tell you that in terms of those two priorities, and Sean, I'm gonna get you to scroll down to the second page because those two priorities are very prominent on the very top of the second page and at the very bottom. So we had requested $37.5 million for performance funding, and the General Assembly in the Free Conference Committee budget appropriated $17.3 million. That represents a 2% increase on the originally enacted 2020-21 budget. So about 40 to 42% of what we had recommended. So that is really good news. I will tell you that, and we'll see more about this in a minute, but Senate Bill 135, President Thompson was just talking about that operationalize the post-secondary education working group recommendations as they pertain to performance funding. Were codified into statute that was signed into law by the governor last week. And so CPE and Kctcs staffs will be using the statutorily defined performance funding models to distribute that $17.3 million. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. And if Sean, if you'll scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see that we've got a bullet there that references the Resurgence Fund, which is the pool of funding for asset preservation. And unfortunately, that did not survive the budget process. So there was zero funding for asset preservation, no debt service, no bond funds. So if there was one minor disappointment in that FCCR budget, it's that we didn't seize on this opportunity to help our campuses address over a $7 billion asset preservation need. But if you would, Sean, go back up to the first page. There's some other items in here I want to call your attention to, and we'll see these in a spreadsheet in just a minute. The FCCR budget reduced the general fund appropriation of the post-secondary institutions in the current year in 2020-21, and that was related to a federal fund swap that was implemented by the Office of the State Budget Director in the current year. Essentially what they did was reduce each institution's base budget, and the total for the public post-secondary institutions was $20 million, and then they backfilled those general fund reductions with dollar-for-dollar funding in federal funds from coronavirus relief funds. And as the second bullet there indicates that, those dollars were replaced with the CRF funds. They did provide a current year appropriation for the KSU land grant program. KSU's award from the federal government, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, actually went up by $1,061,600 in the current year. So in addition to providing that increase of a little over $1 million next year, they went ahead and provided a current year appropriation for the KSU land grant program so that it could be fully matched both years of the biennium. If you will, Sean, go ahead and scroll down. And I'm going to go through this rather quickly because we're going to see it on the spreadsheet. That first bullet under 2021-22 shows the fund swap restorations. That's providing that dollar for dollar restoration for each institution of the reduction in general fund that took place in the current year. The General Assembly did roll to the base in the second year of the biennium. The performance funds, that $14,994,800 that was distributed in the current year to the post-secondary institutions, that was rolled to their base budgets for next year. And then the performance fund itself was zeroed out to reflect that distribution. So the net impact is zero on those campuses, or excuse me, on that particular source of funding. If you'll scroll down just a little bit, Sean, the FCCR budget did provide $22.1 million in additional appropriations to help the comprehensive universities, with the exception of Northern Kentucky University and Kctcs, transition to a fixed dollar allocation method of determining KERS pension contributions for employees that are in non-hazardous positions. This is new funding. It is an additional appropriation. However, that additional appropriation is expected to be offset by increased cost of those pension contributions. And as you can see in the second bullet there, that level of funding is expected to cover 100% of the marginal cost increase for next year. That third bullet is vitally important. The General Assembly line itemed every appropriation to the participating comprehensive universities and Kctcs for this pension funding as mandated programs. And so that allows us to deduct that funding out of the allocable resources that we run through the performance funding model. So those pension funds will be excluded from the funding models going forward. If you'll scroll on down, Sean, we've already talked about performance funding. There were a handful of mandated programs that received additional funding. We've already talked about the KSU Land Grant Program. There's the $1,061,600 in the second year for the KSU Land Grant Program. The School of Dentistry at the University of Louisville received new funding of $100,000 to support a program in that school. And then the Moorhead Craft Academy received an additional $329,000 in 2021-22 to accommodate increased enrollment at the Craft Academy. Scroll on down, Sean. Two institutions had debt service included in their regular appropriations in the second year of the biennium. One was UK, and it was a little over $1 million, as you can see there. And that represents a full year's debt service on $14 million in bond funds to support a capital project at UK, and we'll see what that capital project is in a second. And then there was a half year's debt service for KSU of $182,000 in the second year to support $5 million in bond funds for their capital project. And Sean, if you'll scroll on down, let's take a look at those capital projects in the capital investment section. And there you can see it. UK is, the scope of UK's capital project is actually $28 million. 14 million of that will be funded with general fund supported bond funds, the other 14 million with other funds. And it's to improve the Sanders Brown Center on Aging and Neuroscience. And the $5 million in bond funds for Kentucky State is for roof repair and replacement of education and general facilities. I will point out that NKU received $320 million in agency bond authority. And those are funds that they are going to use to leave the Kentucky retirement system. And as you can see in the second bullet, their Board of Regents voted on December 2nd, 2020 to cease participation in KERS, and that becomes effective June 30th of this year. If there was one disappointment, at least in my mind, in addition to the not receiving any asset preservation funding, there was no appropriation to support the Better Kentucky Promise Scholarship Program. I think a number of folks in senior leadership here at CPE thought that that program had a lot of potential, but it was just not in the cards for this particular budget cycle. Sean, if we go to the table, it's, at least in my mind, I like to see things in a spreadsheet and then I can understand them. Is there a way you can zoom in just a little bit? What this is showing are the numbers in the free conference committee report budget. And of course, it is general fund appropriations for post-secondary institution operations. On the top half of the page, we're showing fiscal 2021 or the current year. And then on the bottom half of the page, we're showing next year. And what we're trying to show with this spreadsheet is how you get from column A, which was the originally enacted a regular general fund in the current year. And that was House Bill 352 that was enacted in the 2020 regular session. And so the institution started out with about $865.7 million there in column A. In column B, we're showing that fund swap reduction totaling $20 million. And if you look over to the far right, you'll see two columns that say 2021 fund distributions. And you can see the federal coronavirus relief funds that were used to backfill that reduction in general fund. And it is on a dollar for dollar basis for each institution and 20 million in total. Column C is the additional 1 million and change for the KSU land grant program. And then column D, those are the actual numbers that can be found, the regular appropriation for each institution and for the performance fund for the current year that can be found in the Fccr budget. If you will, scroll down just a little bit, Sean. So we pull those same numbers from column D and replicate those in column E, and that's the starting point for the second year of the biennium. Column F is the restoration of that reduction in general fund. These are general fund dollars that are being back in to make the post-secondary institutions whole, if you will, after that reduction in the current year. Column G shows the performance distribution from the current year. And as you can see, it's a negative 14.9 million for the performance fund. And that's why we say it's a net zero impact. Column H shows the additional pension funding by institution. Every comprehensive institution, with the exception of Northern, received some funding, and Kctcs did as well. UK and University of Louisville do not participate in the Kentucky retirement system, so they did not receive any of these funds. Column I is the $17.3 million performance fund allocation. And then column J are other base adjustments. You can see the $1 million, 13,000 for UK debt service, 182,000 for KSU debt service, and then the other appropriations are various mandated programs. But those numbers in column K, which are the sum of columns E through J, are the numbers that represent the direct appropriations for each institution and the performance fund that can be found in the free conference committee report budget. So that's kind of an overview of the different funding components in the Fccr budget and how they compared to our priorities that were approved by the council. Does anybody have any questions or any comments they'd like to make? Hearing none, Sean, if you go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint presentation. The next two items on our agenda are the update on performance funding and then providing committee members with some policy relevant data to hopefully facilitate a tuition and fee discussion. Go ahead, Sean, next slide. And we're going to do the performance funding update first, of course. And what we're going to be covering in the next 12 to 14 slides are what you see in this overview. We're going to provide some background information first, primarily what was the impetus for developing the funding model, what were we trying to accomplish, what were the state goals. Sean's going to share a little bit of information about the post-secondary education working group. Who were the participants? What were they charged to do? How many times did they meet? That kind of information. These next three bullets are related to what the post-secondary education working group was charged to do, and that is to determine whether the funding models were functioning as expected, identify any unintended consequences, and then recommend any adjustments to the model that they deem necessary. And so we're going to provide you some of that information. And then lastly, we'll provide an update on the current status of the working group's recommendations and the distribution for performance funding for fiscal year 2021-22. Sean, if you'll go to the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And I think we can get through these background slides pretty quickly, Sean, just hit the high points. And just to give the committee members some information about this particular presentation. President Thompson had been asked to come before the Budget Review Subcommittee on Education a couple of weeks ago, and we had actually put together this presentation for President Thompson to give at that budget review meeting because they had asked for an update on performance funding. So go ahead, Sean, just quickly go through the background information and then the information about the working group.
Sure thing. We try to never let a good presentation go to waste. So just a reminder, the main reason that the funding models were developed was to rectify funding disparities that had developed over time since the old budget model was essentially base plus or base minus, and it didn't adjust funding to account for changes in enrollment or mission or student success. So as you can see in the chart on this slide, in 2015-16, Northern and Western compared to the other comps were funded below average in terms of per FTE funding pretty considerably. It would require about an additional $15 million to bring them up to the median. And so this was really one of the impetuses for creating the models. In addition, in the 16-18 biennial budget, there was language included requiring CPE to convene the working group and to develop a comprehensive funding model and to create a funding model that would accelerate progress toward the attainment of state goals and to address some of those limitations that we discussed. So that really describes the impetus for the model. Of course, the models were developed keeping the state's educational achievement goal in mind, 60 by 30, our North Star. Of course, by the year 2030, the goal is to have 60% of Kentuckians to have a post-secondary certificate or higher. Of course, there are many benefits to higher education that accrue to both, the individual student, but also to the larger community, such as better earnings, more job security, more robust economic development, and so on and so forth. So the models were designed to incentivize and reward state goals for higher education, increase retention and progression towards timely completion, increase degrees and credentials awarded, produce more STEM plus H degrees and credentials and degrees and credentials that lead to higher wages and that serve high demand industries in the state, and close achievement gaps by growing degrees and credentials earned by underrepresented minority students, low-income students, underprepared students. By statute, the Post-Secondary Education Working Group is composed of the president of the Council on Post-Secondary Education, the president of each of the public post-secondary institutions, so the university president of Kctcs, the governor or his designee, and a member of the House and a member of the Senate. The governor designated State Budget Director John Hicks as his representative. Senator David Givens and Representative James Tipton were appointed by the leaders of their respective chambers. And in the performance funding statute, there is a review that's required every 3 years by this post-secondary education working group. The working group is to meet and determine if the comprehensive funding model is functioning as expected. They are to identify any unintended consequences that come about as a result of the model, and they are to recommend any adjustments to the model. And of course, they have to report the results of their review and their recommendations to the governor and to the legislature. The work group met 6 times this fiscal year, starting July 30th. At that July meeting, they reviewed trends in student success data, and they also reviewed the results of a survey that was sent out to all the institutional presidents. In September, they heard from HCM strategists. They're a national leader on performance funding. And they also heard from Kctcs about changes that system would like to see to the model. In October, the work group reviewed financial impact data, campus assessments of the funding model, and proposals to address the redistribution of base funding, and also to address the issue of the fiscal cliff that had developed at some of the institutions. And we'll talk about that fiscal cliff a bit more in a minute. In November, the work group reviewed and discussed some of the major decision points in more detail. And some of those major decision points included the appropriate stop loss percentage, the appropriate small school adjustment, or the appropriate carve out for just open the doors money, non-resident student weighting, how much should a Kentucky student count in the model versus a student from another state, premiums for underserved populations, and the weighting between sectors. So a lot of information was covered at these meetings. In late November, the work group continued their discussions of the major decision points and started to coalesce around a set of recommendations. And then finally, in December, there were final discussions, and ultimately agreement was reached on the recommendations. And I'll go over a summary of some of the findings. Or I think Bill's going to do that.
Yeah, I'll jump back in, Sean. On the next couple of slides, we're going to get to the question of were the models functioning as expected. And these are some of the summary findings of the working group. And of course, the most basic finding is that state funding was no longer going to be distributed based on historical share, but based on the number of outcomes produced. Unlike the previous approach, which was that base plus, base minus funding approach, where there were across the board increases or across the board decreases, this new approach reflected changes in enrollment, program mix, and degrees awarded. And we're going to see in just a minute that institutions that achieve growth in student success outcomes above the sector average increase their funding share. And the model was actually designed with that purpose in mind, and that is indeed what the working group found, that the model was functioning as intended. In that third bullet, you can see that in both the university and Kctcs models, institutions have been moving toward funding parity. And in the last bullet, the model does provide incentives for student progression and completion. And there are premiums included in the model for STEM plus H, underrepresented minority, and low income degrees. This next bullet, I think, is very important. A number of our institutions have reacted to these models strategically. There is now increased alignment, we believe, between campus and state goals, and some of that is borne out by the surveys that were filled out by the campus presidents. Several institutions have adopted internal budget allocation models to reward performance, and they're aligning performance within their own institutions with some of the metrics at the state level. And then lastly, and we're going to show you some information that verifies this next bullet as well, there's expanded emphasis on need-based aid and completion grants. These next two bullets get to some of hold on, Sean, go back. These next two bullets get to some of the results that have been achieved since the funding models have been enacted. And you're going to see that in a couple of graphs we have here in just a minute. But since 2014, bachelor's degrees awarded have grown by 12% in total, 30% in STEM plus H fields, and 40% among underrepresented minority students. And since 2016, Kctcs credentials have increased by 28% in total, 29% in STEM plus H fields, and 40% among underrepresented minority students. And most importantly, as Sean said, this is our North Star or guiding light, if you will, that 60 by 30 educational attainment goal. And we are making significant progress toward achieving that goal. And we believe that the performance funding model and other student success initiatives implemented at the state level and by our campuses are contributing to that. Next slide, Sean. And this is kind of a busy slide. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it. If you look at those red arrows to the left, they're pointing out that we're showing you information on two metrics within the funding model. One is bachelor's degrees with a pool size of 46.6 million in the current year. And the other metric is student credit hours earned with a pool size of $181.1 million in the current year. Those first two columns of numbers are comparing the 3-year rolling average of degrees and student credit hours earned in 1920 versus the 3-year rolling average in the current year, 2020-21. And then the next two columns show the volume change and the percent change. And the way that this model operates, if you look highlighted in blue, you can see that the sector average, and this is for the public university funding model. So within the university sector, there was 2.5% growth on average between 1920 and 2021 in terms of bachelor's degrees produced. Two institutions, the University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville, you can see their percent change highlighted in yellow, which indicates that their percent growth was above the average. And so if you look over to the far right, we're comparing the share of funding in 2019-20 that each institution received with the share of funding in 2020-21 that each institution received. And you can see at the University of Kentucky, their share increased from 32.7% to 33.7%. At the University of Louisville, their share increased from 20.7% to 21.2%. So the way the model operates, if you achieve a level of productivity that exceeds the sector average on any of these metrics, you have the potential to increase your share. And I will say that magnitude matters. If you look on the bottom half of the page, the University of Louisville percent change is 1.1% in terms of student credit hours earned compared to the sector average of 0.9%. Well, that's above the sector average, but it's not very far above the sector average. So if you look at their percent share, it pretty much stayed the same at 23.1%. Between 1920 and 2021. So that's how the model was intended to operate. And of course, the working group found that it was operating as intended. Next slide, Sean. So these next two slides show what kind of progress that we've made in terms of bachelor's degrees produced by degree type and Kctcs credentials by degree type. And for the universities, which is the graph on the left, you can see that there are 4 degree types: total bachelor's degrees, STEM plus H, underrepresented minority, and low income degrees. And we're looking at academic years 2014 through 2020. So within that 6-year time period, total bachelor's degrees increased by 12%, but we achieved substantial growth in terms of our STEM plus H bachelor's degrees and URM bachelor's degrees, 30% and 40% respectively. Where we still have room to improve, obviously, is on the production of low-income bachelor's degrees. And even though there's a premium in the model that provides additional funding for every additional degree awarded to a low-income student, we only increased low-income bachelor's degrees over this time period by 1%. The graph on the right shows the percent change in Kctcs credentials produced, and in this case, it's between 2016 and 2020, so over that 4-year period. And as you can see, the underrepresented minority credentials, underprepared credentials, and targeted industry credentials all grew slightly above 40%. high wage, high demand credentials grew by almost 80%. Total credentials grew by close to 28%, which is very positive. But again, credentials awarded to low-income students is lagging behind the others at only about 17% growth over this time period. Next slide, Sean. You've seen this slide before. David Mayhem and Lee Nemec had presented this recently, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this. But the graph to the right, that green shaded area shows average annual growth of about 1.7% in undergraduate degrees and credentials produced. And that's the rate of growth that we need, not just at the public institutions, but the private post-secondary institutions as well. But that's the rate of growth that we need to meet our 60 by 30 goal. And as you can see in 16-17, beginning in 16-17 and every year since, we've been above that level of growth. And so we are very much on track to achieve our 60 by 30 goal if we continue making progress as we have over the last 3 or 4 years. Next slide, Sean. I thought it would be helpful to dive just a little bit deeper into recent trends in not only the STEM plus H degree and credential production on this slide, but also the underrepresented minority degree and credential production. And again, on the left half of the page, we're showing bachelor's degree production at the universities, and on the right-hand side, credential production at Kctcs. In terms of the public universities on the left, the blue bars represent the research universities, the red bars show the growth in STEM plus H bachelor's degrees at the comprehensive universities. And as you can see, in total, between 2014 and 2020, STEM plus H bachelor's degrees grew by a little over 1,500 degrees or 30%. About nearly two-thirds of that increase in production was driven in the research sector, who grew their number of STEM plus H degrees by 45% compared to 20% growth in the comprehensive university sector. In terms of the graph to the right, over that 4-year period shown, Kctcs increased STEM plus H degrees and credentials by 3,100 awards or 29%. And that's a average annual growth rate of 6.6% per year. So despite declines in enrollment that our institutions have experienced over the past 4 or 5 years, at least to this point, it has not had a major impact on the production of STEM plus H degrees. Next slide, Sean. This is very similar information for underrepresented minority degrees. Again, the research universities are shown by the blue bars in the graph on the left, comprehensive universities in the red bars. And as you can see, the number of URM degrees in total increased by 774 degrees over the last 6 years, or by 40%. And the research sector accounted for more than 70% of that growth. Growth in the research sector in terms of awards to underrepresented minority students was 62% compared to 22% at the comprehensive universities. And then if we look at Kctcs degrees and credentials, over 1,300 additional credentials produced over the past 4 years, 40% growth, and a whopping 8.8% average annual growth rate. That's pretty significant, folks, if you're growing by almost 9% per year. Are there any questions to this point? Okay, Sean, I'll turn it back over to you to provide a summary of findings as they pertain to unintended consequences.
The original work group certainly did not intend for the models to redistribute base funds alone. For the past 4 years, Kentucky's performance funding models have been implemented without any new funding from the General Assembly. This has slowed progress toward achieving funding parity among the institutions, likely lowering the institution's abilities to make progress toward achieving state goals. The good news is that for the upcoming fiscal year 21-22, the state budget includes $17.3 million for performance funding. So that's very positive.
Sean, before you go to the next slide, go back one. As I was looking through the presentation this morning, there's one correction in that second bullet that reads all funding in the performance fund came from campus stop loss contributions. It should read came from campus stop loss contributions or other post-secondary institution carve-outs. Because that first year there was a 5% carve-out that was in House Bill 303, the budget bill for that year, and it was not related to a stop loss contribution. So we'll make that correction for posterity's sake.
All right. The work group also pointed out that the lack of new funding meant that in budget cut years, some institutions would, in essence, be cut twice. The first time when they contributed the stop loss amounts, and then again when a budget cut was applied. So another issue that the work group identified was that language in the original performance funding bill did away with stop loss protections in fiscal year 21-22. And this would have meant that 3 of the universities, 6 of the community colleges would go over a fiscal cliff, in essence, in 21-22. Fortunately, these concerns have been addressed with the passage of Senate Bill 135. So we'll discuss that in more detail. On this table shows the performance fund distributions by year. Note that for the first 4 years, all of the dollars have come from a carve out of institutional dollars. For year 4, we expect to see a 0 in the institution contribution column and a $17.3 million for in the yellow new funding category. And this slide shows the magnitude of the fiscal cliff for 21-22 that we had discussed. And so you could see why institutions were concerned. At Kentucky State University, the magnitude of the fiscal cliff, if all of those stop loss and hold harmless protections were removed, was almost 40%. So a decrease in general fund support of $6.8 million on an $18.2 million base. Significant fiscal cliff at Morehead State University of 8%. 6 community colleges would have been affected. The hardest hit being Hazard Community and Technical College, Southeast Community Technical College, 23%, Big Sandy at 19%. So all very concerning. So I'm very happy that Senate Bill 135 is putting some of those, is allaying some of those fears.
Well, and Sean, it was actually that one slide that you just shared with people that I think really motivated members of the post-secondary education working group and Senator Gibbons and others that worked on Senate Bill 135 to try to address this issue within Senate Bill 135. In terms of the recommended adjustments.
So Bill and Sean, can I just stop for 1 second?
Sure.
I know that you're just reporting out what the working group did and recommended, but I do think in the spirit of what performance funding was really intended to do, a piece of that was accountability. And so I'm certainly not suggesting that it would be okay to take from all these schools and deploy to the large institutions. But I do wonder, where are the accountability metrics for the schools that aren't really hitting the targets that they should be? What is the means of accountability?
Bill, let me take this first because I have to jump off and do another here in a second. Kim, I think this is a really good question. As a matter of fact, this bill gives more accountability than the last bill. Last bill, you had an opportunity to, if you performed and got money, it went to your base. This is almost a pure accountability performance funding model. And that is that you never gain any money at all from your base unless you're distributing all the money every time based on performance. So bottom line, the accountability here is that if you don't perform, you get no money. I mean, it's that simple. And the biggest issue that was raised last time that this actually addresses is that, you know, those, because for a while it was a volume-based model, and I don't want to go in great detail on that, but it was like if you had it, you would continue to get it. And the argument from the small schools were, well, we're never going to get an opportunity to really get it because we have these hold harmless in such a manner. And every time we give you a little more of our money, we're going to fall off the cliff. So the accountability became less and less, if you will, because there was really no direct competition after a while. I hate to say that because it's more in depth than that, but just for the sake of that. So this time around, there's no money that goes to base anymore. It's all distributed based purely on outcomes.
Does that, you know, kind of unfairly though, only benefit sort of U of L and UK? Or do we feel like the distribution will work appropriately as expected, just based on their ability to influence the percent, like some of the outcomes based on size and scale?
Well, and we're probably not at liberty to say anything in open forum yet because we're still working through the numbers.
Fair,
when you see the numbers that are coming out this time, you're going to see one or two institutions that's not UK and U of L getting significant amount of dollars. So yeah, so that's what you'll see. You'll see some getting none, by the way, and you'll see some that got more last time getting less this time. So, Bill, am I saying that correctly based on the numbers we just looked at?
That's absolutely correct, President Thompson. You hit the nail on the head, and the accountability for those, and it's not that they're not performing well. They may be improving. They may be growing the number of student credit hours earned. They may be progressing more students. They may be producing more degrees. But if you're at or below that sector average, you're not going to increase your share of funding in this model. But what the recommendations that I'm going to go through here in just a minute it establishes a funding floor that is supposed to be prioritized by the General Assembly over any new funding to performance, to the performance fund. It establishes a 0% stop loss in essence for all of the institutions, so that now the onus is on the General Assembly to provide new funding to incentivize institutions to continue making progress toward the state's educational attainment goal. But the accountability, as President Thompson said, is if you don't perform at that sector average or above on most of these metrics, you just don't get any of that new distribution. But you don't have it taken out of your base and redistributed to some other institution. And that was causing a lot of consternation among campuses that, as Sean said, you know, you do a 1% stop loss in 1 year, then you do a 2% stop loss in the next year. Those are funds taken out of each institution's base budget and put in the performance fund. The General Assembly was not contributing to that fund. And so when those funds were being distributed, it was like a budget cut to some institutions. And so, go ahead, President Thompson.
Let me say one.
No, I think. Yeah. No, I was going to say, Bill, I certainly appreciate that, and I do think that I've certainly heard that feedback that there was a lot of concern about taking out of the baseline to redistribute and what that would look like, and ultimately, over a long period of time, that leads to the death of an institution. Said differently. But the other question I would have around it is just, are we sure that the baselines are set right? Or did we just pick that random number for the baseline?
Well, it's not picked. Bill, let me answer this one, then I got to get off, and I'll let you all finish up because I have to start another one. Whether it's set right or not, I think over the last 3 years, we got it set closer to right, to be honest with you, because of the equalization process that the past performance funding worked toward doing. Now, the argument is, what is it when you have the right base? You may be asking, As someone who's been around this a long time, I'm not sure what the answer is, to be honest with you. I think we can give you something, but I don't think it was randomly set. I think it was set based on exactly what the performance funding model has produced in the last 3 years. So, and that it was originally designed to move as much as you can toward that equilibrium. And so we got close. In other words, I think we were 2 campuses from it. So, and Bill can give you all the numbers on that. The item I would bring to this committee as a statement before I go is that we're talking about what the General Assembly put through. They put through basically a continuation budget, but they gave post-secondary funding. And we talked about what we didn't get, and we would like to have gotten it. I want to talk about what we did get, and I'm extremely blessed that we did, that the governor put it in his budget and we were funded pretty much at the levels that we asked for. That's one thing. I think the other thing too, and I'll give Senator Gibbons and a lot of folks who spoke on the floor for post-secondary that argued that our 60 by 30, our North Star that we talked about, and our arguments about return on investment for higher education, how all of that and the numbers we've been able to produce in gap closing and everything else over and over again in committee, in floor conversations and everything else, they came back to this. So my argument is we've connected our strategic process with the budgetary outputs that we got. And that's what you want to see. It's not just about what we've been cut. I listen to the chair of my board over and over again say, but it's also about exactly what you're producing with the dollars you have. So whether it's the right base or not, my argument is that we need to strategically say that's the base we have. And then how do we best do the return on investment to do the innovative items that we need to do and still produce some of the numbers we're producing and increase in those numbers as well as some of the areas that we know that we need to be increasing in. So that would be the other thing I would offer to the mechanical piece of this conversation, that the strategic piece was noticed, well recognized, and I think rewarded. So I did want to say that if I could.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you, President Thompson.
Thank you.
I think I've already covered most of the things on this slide, but I'll just quickly hit it again. The main recommended adjustments that came out of those post-secondary education working group meetings were that a general fund floor needed to be established, and there's a definition there. And there was a question about whether that's the appropriate base, but it was essentially the current year's originally enacted budget, the regular appropriation for each institution, plus their performance distribution in the current year minus debt service and mandated programs. So that was the floor. And so it wasn't completely arbitrary. It was the level of funding that the institutions received in the current year prior to that $20 million federal fund swap, plus their performance distribution in the current year. And of course, that second bullet was the key, that the hope would be that, and of course, a current General Assembly can't bind future General Assemblies, but the hope would be that policymakers would prioritize maintaining that floor over providing any new funding to the performance fund. So if the need did arise to implement a budget cut, the hope would be that the funding would come out of that performance fund and not out of the base of each institution. And this was something that the overwhelming majority of institutions were in favor of. This third bullet, that there should be no redistribution of base funding among institutions going forward. And we heard several comments from campus presidents, from some of the legislators in their regions, that we were robbing Peter to pay Paul because we were just redistributing funding from one institution to another. And that's what that last bullet is all about, that any funding in the performance fund should come from the General Assembly rather than campus carve-outs. And so going forward, at least for the next 3 years, there will be a 0% stop loss. So no carve-outs for 3 years. Next slide, Sean. The other thing that everyone agreed to was that there would be no changes to the funding model. Everything that was on that previous page just changes how the funding model for the universities and at Kctcs are applied. So no changes in the models themselves. And then lastly, any distributions from the performance fund over the next three years will not be recurring to the institutions. And that's so that there's the opportunity, if the General Assembly chooses to do so, to keep refilling that performance fund every year and let the funds be recurring to the performance fund. Next slide, Sean. So as Sean indicated earlier in the presentation at the December meeting, the last meeting of the working group, there was consensus around a group of recommendations that you just heard that will govern the application of the funding models going forward. And as of March 18th, the governor signed Senate Bill 135 into law, which codified all of those recommendations of the working group into the performance funding statute. And those signatures on the right just show that every campus president and President Thompson participated in the development of those recommendations and fully support those recommendations. So what's the current status in terms of performance funding? As I just said, Senate Bill 135 was introduced to affect the changes that were recommended by the funding group. It was passed by the House and Senate, signed into law March 18th. I think it's significant to point out that there were no negative votes in either the House and Senate. And I think that's a credit to Senator David Gibbons, to our campus presidents that supported that initiative, and to CPE staff, President Thompson in particular, that there were no negative votes and it was fully supported and signed into law by the governor. In terms of the 2021-22 iteration of the university funding model, CPE staff ran those numbers last week, and as President Thompson said, we've seen what those preliminary numbers look like, but we have sent the funding model data and calculations out to the campus CBOs and institutional research directors and asked them to validate that data and get back to us by March 31st. And so we don't want to say anything publicly about those numbers until they become final, and we should know 1 week from today what the distribution will be for next year. And we don't actually have to report that to the Office of the State Budget Director until May 15th, but it's going to be very helpful for our campus CBOs and their presidents as they try to formulate their institutional budgets for the coming year, to know whether or not they're going to receive a performance funding distribution this early in the process. So that's it in terms of the update on performance funding. Does anybody have any additional questions before we move on to the next agenda item? Sean, next slide. Any questions, comments at this point?
We're good, Bill.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next slide, Sean. In terms of the tuition and fee discussion, as I had said earlier, what we wanted to do was try to provide the committee with some information that we hope will help facilitate some discussion at the end of this presentation regarding the tuition and fee decision that needs to be made for next year. And the first part of this presentation, we want to identify what some of the key issues are for 2021-22. And those first two bullets, you've seen those pretty much every year for the last several years. Those are always prominent issues as we get into the discussions about tuition and fee setting. State support for public colleges and universities, as everyone on this call knows, is a major determinant of tuition levels at public colleges and universities, and the cost of educating students go up every year. And state support or state general fund appropriations and tuition and fee revenue are the primary sources for help covering those increases and fixing unavoidable costs. For 6 or 7 years in a row, pension costs were going up every year. And year before last, there was no increase, and there was no increase in the current year just because the General Assembly postponed implementing rate increases on the universities while they were trying to work out this fixed allocation method for moving forward. And so pension costs are still something that we want to look at, but also the state funding that's been provided to help offset those pension costs. As was the case a year ago, COVID-related costs and foregone revenues are a big issue for our campuses right now, but so are the federal relief dollars that are being provided by the CARES Act, by the Kctcs Act. And I've got some information that I'll share with you a little later about the American Rescue Plan. The dollars coming in for the what's called the HERF-3 funding, that there have been 3 rounds of funding of direct grants to institutions, and they're called Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund 1, 2, and 3. Well, that hires in terms of funding that's granted directly to the institutions than the CARES Act and the Kctcs Act combined. So I'm going to take a look at that. And of course, enrollment trends. This is something new for this year, but our council recognized that we're going to have some real issues or difficulties achieving our 60 by 30 goals if our enrollments continue to trend in the direction that they have over the last 4 or 5 years. And the executive committee of the council adopted a resolution recently that called for bold action in this area, and we're going to discuss that. And then lastly, Sean's got some other policy relevant data that we want to share with you. So next slide, Sean. So we've already gone through the FCCR budget, but I just wanted to make it clear that even though the budget shows an increase of $60.5 million in terms of the total general fund appropriation, and that includes mandated programs, debt service, everything. But it shows an increase of $60.5 million from the current year to next year. But much of that increase is not relevant for this upcoming tuition setting cycle. And those 3 bullets that I've got bracketed with that red bracket on the left are the ones that at least in CPE staff view are really not relevant for consideration for this upcoming year, and I'm going to explain why. First, there's an increase of $20 million for that fund swap restoration. Well, even though that is an increase, and I guess technically it could be considered new money, is to restore funding that the institutions already had in their base for the current year that had been reduced and backfilled with those federal funds. And so it's not an increase of $20 million to the current base. So the performance funds that were distributed, that $14.9 million that was added to the base budgets of each individual institution. In the upcoming fiscal year, those funds were already in the post-secondary education performance fund in the current year, and that will be zeroed out next year. So that's not new money either. Now the pension funding, the $22.1 million is new funding. It's absolutely an additional appropriation, but it's expected to be completely offset by an equivalent increase in pension costs. And so those are not dollars that the institutions are going to be able to use to educate students. That's strictly to provide those pension contributions for their current contingent of employees. Now, what is, in my mind, relevant is the 2% increase, or that $17.3 million for the performance fund allocation that's highlighted in green font at the bottom. Those are new dollars coming into the system that our institutions can use to educate students, but not every institution is going to receive a share of that funding. It's very likely, once we get the final numbers, that 3 of our universities will not receive any distribution from that $17.3 million, and at least 5 or 6 of our community colleges won't receive any funding either. And as soon as we finalize those numbers, we'll share those with members of the Finance Committee. Next slide, Sean. You've seen this slide before, in previous years, these are the estimated increases in fixed and unavoidable costs between this year and next. Column A in this template shows the current year, fiscal year 2021 E&G expenses. Those are budgeted numbers for each institution. And then the next 5 columns are the fixed and unavoidable cost components, and those are increases in each of those 5 columns. Those are totaled up in column B, and then column C, if you will. I don't have it labeled, but that column to the far right divides column B by column A to show a percent of E&G expenses. So in terms of what our campuses are estimating to this point, it looks like about a 3.2% increase in fixed and unavoidable costs between the current year and next year. And if you look in the very bottom right-hand corner, the 5-year average annual growth rate in the higher education price index has been 2.4% per year. So that 3.2% is slightly higher than what we're seeing across the country in terms of the average increase in higher education costs. And just quickly, you've seen those 5 components before: salary and personnel expense, FCCA and retirement contributions, maintenance and operations, cost on facilities, increases in student financial aid, and then other costs. I will tell you that $20 million other cost for Northern, that's anticipated debt service on a $320 million agency bond issue to buy out of the Kentucky retirement system. But you will notice that under FCCA and retirement column, there's a $14.7 million reduction in Northern's expense in that year, reflecting that they will be getting out of the Kentucky retirement system. Next slide, Sean.
I would like to add that these numbers are very much draft and subject to change, and that the institutions asked us to forward that message on as well.
Yeah, we've got 2 institutions that have wanted to change one number in this table, and so we'll finalize these between now and our next Finance Committee meeting. The next slide, we've already talked a little bit about pension costs and the state funding to offset those costs. I've already mentioned that comprehensive universities and Kctcs are moving to that fixed allocation method for determining their retirement plan contributions, and that 5 of those universities, all the comps except for Northern and Kctcs, are receiving $22.1 million in total. And you can see those numbers located in the table to the right. And those funds are intended to cover 100% of the cost increase for next year. Now, it's my understanding that in future years, that level of funding will not cover 100% of those cost increases, but at least for the coming year, it's supposed to essentially be a wash. And that's what we say in that next bullet, that from our perspective, the monetary impact should be negligible of rising pension costs for this coming year. That last bullet is very important. I mentioned it earlier. These funds are designated as mandated programs in the budget bill, and so that means they can be excluded from the funding model, and those funds will stay in the base budgets of those institutions, and they will not be penalized for receiving those funds. Next slide, Sean. The COVID-19 cost and foregone revenues is very important, but so is the amount of federal relief funds that our institutions are going to be receiving to defray those costs. What you're looking at right here, and I know it's very busy, it's a template that me and my staff have been working with the CBOs to create. And what we want to capture, both for the public universities on the upper third of the page and Kctcs institutions on the bottom 2/3, is what are all of the federal sources of funding that you're receiving. And so those first 4 columns show the CARES Act funding, and you've got the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund 1, institution maximum. There were some HBCU and strengthening institutional program funds that some of our institutions received. There was the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, totaling $8.8 million for the universities and $2.5 million at Kctcs. Those funds were distributed. And then that fourth column of numbers, the coronavirus relief funds, if you look at the very bottom of that column, the system total, that's that $20 million that was part of that federal fund swap. And so that, to our knowledge, are all of the sources of the CARES Act funding. We want to capture something similar for the Coronavirus Recovery and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, or CARISA funding. And you can see those dollars there, 85.6 million for the institution maximum, 67.7 million for the Kctcs institution maximum. And what we will be adding between those two sources of funding is the American Rescue Plan funding. And here are some of the numbers on that. And the reason we didn't go ahead and put these in the spreadsheet is because these are estimates at this point provided by the American Council on Education. And when we get the official Department of Education and allocations, we will be adding that to this template. But for the public universities, it's $107.4 million just for the HERE 3 funding, the institution maximum, and $74.9 million for Kctcs. So a total of $182.3 million compared to $54,510,000 for HERE 1. And gosh, I've got a problem with my total there. And it's 85.6 plus 67.7. $153.3 million for HERF 2. So the $182.3 million, this will be the biggest round of direct institutional grants to the institutions of the three. But at any rate, on the right-hand third of this page, what we need to show to sort of balance the equation is what were the COVID-19 related costs and foregone revenues. We want to capture that both for fiscal year 2019-20 and for fiscal year 2021 so that we can compare the green columns over to the far right with the green columns in the center of the page. What's the total amount of federal funding that's been received, and what are the total costs and foregone revenues? And what you don't see, I know this spreadsheet looks very detailed, but we've got probably about an 8 to 10 page extremely detailed spreadsheet where we've asked the institutions to fill out templates that match what they're reporting to the federal government. There's all kind of eligible expense categories, eligible foregone revenue categories. And in order to draw down these funds, institutions, in many cases, have to spend their own funds and then submit requests for reimbursement to draw down those funds. And so my understanding is they will not be able to draw down the federal funds unless they have eligible expenses or eligible foregone revenues that have been approved at the federal level. So as they submit those reimbursement forms, they're going to be filling out these detailed templates for us that will help us populate this COVID-19 related costs and foregone revenue section of this summary spreadsheet, if you will. Now, I will caution you that this is going to be what we call a living and breathing document because every few months as they submit more and more eligible cost and lost revenue to the federal government, the numbers are obviously going to change. But we want to have a very reasonable approach for allowing our institutions to report this information and to keep track of the uses of these CARES Act funds and CARISA funds and the ARP funding. So hopefully we'll be able to share with you some preliminary numbers prior to our April 13th Finance Committee meeting in terms of this template. The last key issue, and as I said earlier, this is a new issue for this upcoming tuition and fee cycle, has to do with enrollment trends at our public universities and Kctcs, and the council resolution that was adopted on March 3rd by the executive committee of the council. Since 2013, the comprehensive universities and Kctcs have experienced steady enrollment declines, and you can see this in the graph to the right. That graph is showing full-time equivalent student enrollment by sector between fall semesters 2013 and 2020. The red line represents enrollment at the research universities, the blue line FTE enrollment at the comprehensives, and the green line is Kctcs. And as you can see by looking at the trend in the blue line at the top, there's been a decrease of 6,413 FTE students, or 11% over this time period at the comprehensive universities. And there's been a decrease of 11,287 FTE, or 22% at Kctcs. If you look at the red line, it's been relatively flat since fall semester 2015. So our research institutions are not seeing the same level of decline as we're seeing in our comprehensive university sector or at Kctcs. Yeah, the bullet at the very bottom, we only had one institution that recorded an FTE enrollment increase over this period, and that was the University of Kentucky that had a 4% increase. I think our council members rightly identified some of the causes of the enrollment decline in that resolution. Declining numbers of high school graduates, falling college going rates, and at least in terms of the most recent year, this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know all of our council members know what was in that resolution they adopted, but I wanted, for those that might be tuning in from the public, to know what was in that resolution. The council members expressed concern about the effect of further enrollment decline on our ability to meet our 2030 goals. And then they went further. They called on CPE leadership and the campus leaders to implement bold actions and strategies to mitigate the near-term enrollment effects of COVID-19. And this is a decision for the finance committee of the council and for our broader council in general. But obviously maintaining affordability for Kentucky students and families is one possible strategy for encouraging, or at least trying to maintain enrollment in the near term. So any questions about any of those key issues?
I think we're good, Bill. Thanks.
Sean, take us home.
Bill asked me to go over these next few slides. This slide shows a look at state appropriations from fiscal year 2008 to 2021. On the left in blue, you can see that the change in nominal dollars for post-secondary institution operations is $238 million, or 22%. On the right side, we've adjusted the funding to account for inflation and are showing it per FTE student between 2008 and 2021. State funding for institutions has decreased by $3,621 per student, or about 38%. And of course, as we pointed out, Kentucky was one of only a handful of states that had not reinvested in higher education following.
And Sean, I'm so glad that, if the governor signs House Bill 192 into law, that we're not going to be able to make that statement any longer.
That's correct.
So, hey, Sean, really quick, this is just Kim. Maybe you're going to get ready to show me this. I was going to say, do we have the FTE data by institution?
We can certainly get that.
Okay, that would just be interesting to look at.
Yeah, we have it.
This slide shows tuition and mandatory fees from 2011 to 2021. On the far right, you can see the growth per sector for the research institutions you can see that the 5-year average annual growth rate in tuition and fee sticker charge is 2.6% for over the last 5 years. Over the last 10 years, that average annual growth rate was 3.7%. Comprehensive institutions, universities, 3.3% average annual growth rate over the last 5 years, 3.8% over the last 10 years. And Kctcs over the last 5 years, 3.8% average annual growth rate. Over the last 10 years, 3.7%. And for the system, 3.1% growth over the last 5 years, 3.8% over the last 10 years. If we look back a few more years, we can see that that there were years of pretty large increases in tuition and fees between 2002 and 2010. In those years, CPE had devolved responsibility for setting tuition to the campus governing boards. Beginning in FY 2011, the council resumed that role, that statutory role in tuition setting, and initiated the tuition and fee ceilings. Over the past 11 years, the average annual growth rate is below 4%, 3.9%. And we believe that planning for college is more, it's easier to plan for college if the average annual rate of growth is at a lower and more reasonable level. So a very good question. When setting tuition, how does Kentucky tuition and fees compare to other states? On the left, you see the 4-year resident undergraduate tuition and fees in Kentucky in red compared to tuition resident undergraduate tuition and fees in surrounding states. Kentucky is just above the median there. On the right-hand side of the page, you see tuition and fees at the 2-year colleges. Resident tuition and fees at Kctcs ranks highest among similar institutions in surrounding states at $5,610. Of course, we point this out every year. Unlike most other states, Kctcs does not receive local appropriations, so this helps explain their tuition ranking.
Sean, Bob Stat here. How does Kentucky rank discount rate wise? In other words, total costs or student cost, actual out of pocket.
Bill, do you have a?
Well, if you're referring to net price, that's in a couple of slides that we're coming to. Sorry
about that. Got it.
I will say that Kentucky is a high aid state. So you can see Kentucky in red here, ranked 6th highest in terms of state aid. So $1,573 per student on average in fiscal 2019. That's 169% of the U.S. average. And we've been towards the right, on the right side of this graph for the past past decade. On the right-hand side of the page, you see that federal aid per student has been flat or trending down. That's represented with the blue line there. State grants have been flat or trending up in recent years. But the good news story here is that campus funded grants and scholarships have been growing at a pretty good rate since 07-08. And that's a really good news story for Kentucky.
Sean or Bill, can you tell, just curious, what is it that South Carolina and Georgia do to have such success in their financial aid programs, if you know?
I know
Georgia has the Hope Scholarship, so that's a very high profile scholarship nationally. They're kind of known for that. I'm not as familiar with South Carolina. Bill, did you have anything to add?
Well, and you've got a number of states like Tennessee implementing promise programs, which is something that the governor proposed for this upcoming year. And of course, as you know, Sean, CPE worked with Kia to, identify some of the elements that would be included in that type of program. And that's why we were very hopeful that we could get that off the ground. It's a last dollar scholarship. And so we're not talking about an exorbitant amount of funding. And that's why you have a number of states moving in that direction. But I have not done any direct comparisons of our financial aid programs in Kentucky to either South Carolina or Georgia. I know that we probably focus a little bit less of our dollars that are flowing through Kia on need-based aid than other states. And I think that needs to be more of a focus moving forward. I mean, what we're seeing in terms of low income degree production, lagging URM and STEM plus H degree production, that's very concerning to me. And you're going to see on this next slide that dollars do make a difference. If you start providing funding to meet some of that unmet need, which the University of Kentucky, for example, has done with their UK Leads program, it does have an impact on net price, which in turn has an impact on student enrollment in terms of students from low-income families. And I think that's something that CPE staff and our council needs to focus on. We're making great progress in terms of production of underrepresented minority degrees, in terms of STEM plus H degrees. But we need to get all of our eyes focused on, producing more degrees among low-income students, because Kentucky has proportionately large number of low-income students in post-secondary education.
I can't help but to see this green line here, campus funded grants and scholarships, and just be amazed that in an environment with such limited resources that our institutions have really stepped up. And
that's a real credit to them, Sean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This next slide shows net price of college attendance. The blue line represents the research universities. The red is the comprehensive universities, and the green is the Kctcs institutions. And I think this is a very much a good news story that at Kctcs, a very flat net price over from 2009 to 2019. Similar story at the comprehensive institutions, and
well, until we get to 2016-17, we were reporting that time period between 2011-12 and 2015-16 as a success story among our comprehensive universities, because you've got about 5 years in a row there where net price did not increase at all. But then in 2016-17 and in 2017-18, as you can see, there was an uptick in the average net price paid. Glad to see it dipping back down in 2018-19, but it's something we need to keep a close watch on. And I'm also very pleased to see that that trend line for the research universities between 2009-10 and 2016-17, it was just steady increases in the average net price. And as you can see, for about 3 years in a row now, it's been relatively flat in the research sector. And I think the table that Sean's going to go over that's on the right-hand side of the page has a lot to do with why you see a flattening of that curve in terms of average net price in the research sector. But go ahead, Sean.
Bill or Sean, my question earlier was, this data, does it reposition Kctcs on the state charts? Or are we still high?
I know that net price is something we've looked at in the past. Community colleges in Kentucky versus surrounding states. We just need to refresh that information.
That's why I was just curious if it repositioned us in that graph.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we have provided that information in the past. We don't have it for you today.
So
We'll
fine.
We'll try to have it prior to the April 13th meeting.
That's fine. I just was curious.
In fact, Sean, I guess I should provide a caveat for the table and the information on the right. It was my plan to actually have a chart there that provided an interstate comparison of net prices in Kentucky to surrounding states. And we had some issues with some of the data. And I contacted the folks at UK and asked if they would mind if we shared this data from the University of Kentucky. And we actually shared that information on an institution by institution basis with all of our CBOs a couple of CBO meetings ago, and we're in the process of validating the data. But UK was one of only a couple of institutions that have gotten back with us and indicated that this average net price data by income quintile is correct for their institution. And that's why I went ahead and decided to include this today. But go ahead, Sean.
Well, this chart shows information we received from the integrated post-secondary data system from iPads, and it's net price by income quintile, and you can see that, you know, from 16-17 to 18-19 at UK that they've put in policies and to decrease the net price for lowest income students, and actually for every students at every income level. And so as the bullet points out, the average net price for resident undergraduates decreased 2,787 or 19%. For those in the bottom income quintile, fell by 2,446 or 16% for those in the second lowest income quintile. So as we suggest, you know, perhaps programs like UK Leads, programs that target students with unmet financial need are very effective in bringing that net price down.
Well, and Sean, I also want to point out that we've got some other positive stories that we could tell about other institutions. I've got some data in front of me right now that we'll try to put into a table or a chart prior to our next Finance Committee meeting. But in 2018, at the University of Louisville, the average debt of university graduates was the lowest of any of the public universities in Kentucky, 24,630. Much lower average student loan debt than a number of our other institutions. Also, if you look at overall net price, something that we want to highlight is that Kentucky State University has done very well and has a similar trend to what we're seeing at UK in lowering that net price in the lowest income quintile and in the second lowest income quintile between 2017 and 2019. In the lowest income quintile, the net price has dropped from almost $9,300 down to close to $6,650. And so it's not only low to begin with, but we're seeing a trend that net price is being reduced at Kentucky State University. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out what's been going on at Northern. Northern actually had a decrease in their net price for the lowest quintile between 2018 and 2019. It's dropped from almost $5,300 down to $4,150. And that Northern has the lowest net price next to KSU of any of the comprehensive universities. And it's been that way for a number of years. So we'll try to provide, we'll try to provide some of that information at the April Finance Committee meeting.
These are all undergraduate numbers, right?
Yes,
The debt
Yes.
service, they're undergraduate, right?
correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And just to finish out the conversation, student loan debt, the average amount of student loan debt peaked in 2016 and has remained rather flat the following 3 years. So that's a good news story. And the percentage of students taking out loans has actually gone down somewhat from a high of 64%. And then here's a comparison of Kentucky's average loan debt compared to the surrounding states. And Kentucky is towards the bottom there at 28.4, third from the bottom. So we think that's a good news story as well.
Next slide, Sean. Okay. Well, that concludes our presentations. Chair Branstetter, there's about 20 minutes remaining. If you would like to facilitate a discussion with the other council members about this upcoming tuition and fee cycle. I will tell you that we've had 2 meetings with the CBO group, and then President Thompson has had a meeting in March with the campus presidents. And what we've been communicating to both the CBOs and the campus presidents to this point is that given that we're still in the COVID-19 pandemic, given the enrollment trends that we're seeing and the need to try to maintain enrollment to the extent that we can to keep making progress toward our 60 by 2030 goal, is that the starting point for the discussion is 0% increase or near 0% increase. And so that's what we put on the table as an initial starting point for the discussion. But I'm gonna turn it over to you, Chair Branstetter, and I'm gonna go see if I can locate those FTE numbers that someone asked about.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. That's a lot of data and content to try to wrap your arms around. So, Eric, I feel for you. Colby, I feel for you. And for the rest of us who've been around for a while, it's good to see the updated data and see kind of where we've gone in the past, especially over the last 5 or 10 years. So, what you doing there, Bill?
I don't know if it was Carol or Kim, but somebody asked if they could see the full-time equivalent student enrollment numbers.
Got it.
By institution.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was looking at I was asking for, this is actually good to see, but I was looking at the, when we were doing that budget slide, we had the FTE data based on the budget. I was looking at the breakout of that by university.
Oh, you mean the funding per FTE?
Yes, that's right. The funding per FTE by university. Sorry if I wasn't clear on that. And I don't have to have it right now. You can send that.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill. I guess I think you did a pretty good job of laying the groundwork for all the issues. All the adds and the deducts. You're kind of keeping a column there, reserving a column there for how we're gonna handle that, and at least so that we all recognize that's kind of one-time money, and it's not going into the models and stuff. So I'll kind of open it up to the floor. We've been going for about an hour 45, and for those of you who are on ASI this morning, that's another hour or so of Zoom of higher ed Zoom calls. So does anybody have any comments at this point in time they want to share with the group?
So Kim, Ben, this is Kim. I would just say as an overall, we spent a lot of time and had some consternation last year around our tuition setting process. And we made the decision to forego setting a cap based on lack of information that was available at the time and not really sure what the future held. So we did that for 1 year. And I would say, I think that we're still in a similar position. I think we should consider doing that again as we move forward if there isn't consensus to have a 0 tuition cap amongst all of the universities. So they've proven themselves in a 10-year time frame that they've behaved well. No one was out of line last year when we gave the flexibility that was needed. And it feels like for 1 additional year, given the time frame that we're in, recommending to keep that or abdicating our opportunity to set a cap for 1 additional year is something that I feel pretty strongly about.
All right, I know this won't be the last of these discussions, so we'll be having further discussions over the course of the next few months. I think we've got, I don't have the schedule in front of me, but we're meeting, Bill, I think we're meeting monthly with finance. You don't need to necessarily share the screen, but we've got meetings monthly with an ultimate goal of a final recommendation to the to the full council I believe at our June meeting is when we'll wrap up, correct?
No, it's at our April 16th meeting.
Oh, well, by June, we'll have the institution's final.
Yes.
All
yes,
their final
yes,
documents.
yes.
Yeah.
The tuition parameters would typically be set at the April CPE meeting, and then the campus proposals would be approved at the June meeting. And our next Finance Committee meeting is April 13th.
Got it. Okay. All right. Anybody have anything else? No? All right. I believe that takes care of everything on the agenda. Bill, Sean, thanks for rolling through everything for us today. And we'll see everybody soon. All those in favor of adjourning, hit the leave button on your Zoom.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.